Otomotiv satış sonrası pazarını etkileyen Gelecek, Trendler ve Fırsatlar sunumuyla sizleri buluşturmak istiyoruz. Sunumunu gerçekleştirmesi üzere Frost & Sullivan Otomotiv Grubu lideri Sayın Mubarak MOOSA'yı alkışlarınızla sahneye davet ediyorum. I kindly invite Mr. MOOSA to the stage to make his speech, please. Hi and welcome.
Hi, thank you. Excellent. Very good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. Before I start, maybe I'll quickly introduce myself. You will be wondering who I am and what I'm doing here. My name is Mubarak MOOSA. I'm one of the partners in the company called Frost & Sullivan. I'll talk about the company soon. I've been in the company for 18 years now. I lead the global aftermarket, global automotive market research. Currently, I live in the UK, but I also had the pleasure of living in Istanbul. I lived in Istanbul for almost 5 years. I have very fond memories of this particular city. Çok az Türkçe konuşuyorum, but I'm not going to speak in Turkish today. I thank OCSA for having me here. It's a great pleasure. I love coming to this beautiful city, meeting all the beautiful people, quite hospitable here. Now, talking about my company, we are a business intelligence, or what we call the market intelligence, and a consulting firm, market advisory firm. We advise companies on go-to-market, route-to-market, mergers and acquisitions, and various topics. And here I'm going to present on opportunities in the aftermarket, particularly, talking also about the trends in the automotive market. So for the agenda today, I'll start talking about disruptive trends impacting the overall mobility market. When I say mobility, I'm going to refer more specifically on the automotive-related topics. Then we talk more specifically related to aftermarket, the trends in the aftermarket, the challenges that you see in the aftermarket, and of course the opportunities and the strategic directions primarily. Now, before I start with, I want to set the scene in terms of how my company sees the future of the mobility market, the mobility market by 2040. In 10 to 12 years' time, we can expect the sales of EV or electric vehicles to surpass the sales of ICE vehicles. And in this context, primarily driven by, of course, the improvement in battery technology, the development in the infrastructure, the awareness increase amongst the customers, and of course, the various models that will be available in the market primarily. When you talk about EV, it is just not about EV. It is also a plethora of business models that will drive new opportunities in the electric vehicle models, including charging infrastructure, which will cover the public charging, the home charging, and of course, the other business models related to charging infrastructure, including, say, swapping models, also talking about, say, energy systems and large-scale energy systems deployment. There's a new business model that the EVs will unleash overall. The next key trend that we can expect to see is connected and software-defined vehicles. There are a lot of discussions on this particular topic, but what is important here is the software-defined vehicles and connectivity will redefine the IP of the automotive industry. Primarily, the IP of automotive industry was built around the engine technology. If EV is going to take the center stage, the OEMs are looking to new IP development, new differentiations, and that's where SDV and connectivity will play a key important role. And in this context, even the SDV and the connectivity will drive new business models and opportunities that you can be able to generate revenue throughout the life cycle of the vehicle. We have heard from companies like Stellantis or, say, Ford or GM, where they have in fact earmarked around, say, $10 to $20 billion of revenues to come from connected solutions, be it features on demand or in-car sales, data monetization, data utilizations, and so on. Talking about autonomous vehicles, when you look into autonomous vehicles, it might be a distant reality to see completely level 5 autonomous vehicles on road. But that said, autonomous or ADAS systems will be adopted in phases. Currently, we look at a phase where level 2 or 2.5 systems will evolve into level 3. And primarily, we'll also expect to see robo-taxis on the road. Now, we are talking about robo-taxis. We all know on October 10th last year, Elon Musk unveiled a striking line of, say, robots and taxis. And we can expect to see a lot more robo-taxis on the streets in particular geographies. When we talk about autonomous vehicles, again, it might be a distant reality, but what is more important here is to look into the business models that will come along with autonomous vehicles. We can expect to see BOM. BOM means build, own, operate, and maintain business model. It will create a platformization of transportation. You can also expect to see hub-to-hub autonomous corridors. When you talk about hub-to-hub autonomous corridors, even in, say, Autobahn in Germany, or say highways in the US, you can expect to see commercial vehicles driven on autonomous landscape primarily. Multimodality. Now, talking about multimodality, there's always been a question mark around shared mobility systems, say car sharing or ride sharing. Always a question on the profitability of these kind of business models. What we can expect to see in the future is, with the changing consumer pattern, with the changing demography, and also increasing penetration of connected and autonomous vehicles, more integrated mobility will develop, and this will unleash profitability and sustainability in multimodal transportation. And last but not the least, by the end of next decade, we can definitely expect to see flying cars or urban air mobility, and of course drone delivery, which will in fact create a three-dimensional mobility ecosystem overall. Now, whatever I said might be quite exciting, can be quite interesting to talk about, but it's also important that we take a stock to understand what is the ground reality and what are the key trends impacting the automotive market. Now, that's where I talk about the macro trends impacting the automotive market. Some of these trends were widely discussed earlier. Whenever I talk about macro trends, I always like to start my presentation talking about macroeconomics, but with Trump in the White House, it's very difficult for any forecaster to predict how the direction or how the GDP will grow in the future. Trump and Trump policies making America great again is all about, say, the protectionist policies. It's all about dilution of the environmental ecosystem or environmental policy. And also, last but not the least, more in terms of driving business into US. So in this trend, it's just not US. We have seen in other countries also, even in Turkey, for example, if I'm not wrong, you have higher taxes for Chinese vehicles or Chinese products, but it's not the same applicable for BYD, who's locally producing in Turkey, which means this particular trend we can expect to see deglobalization or more localization to drive in many countries. And talking about Trump and Trump war, end of last year, our economic team looked at a global GDP of around 3.2%, but since Trump has come into the White House, they have been adjusting the GDP, and we expect the GDP to be global GDP to be around 2.9 to 3% this time. Early in the morning, Ali Bey mentioned about global conflicts. In 2010, there were around 88 conflicts, and currently we're looking at around 170 different conflicts globally. When you talk about global conflicts or wars, this also has a wider impact in terms of the energy ecosystem, the commodity prices, and that will drive, with the current, say, low level of diplomacy, this will be a key trend impacting the overall economic ecosystem going forward. Along with Trump, we also have seen the new package of Elon Musk. Of course, there has been a changing pattern when it comes to Elon Musk, when it comes to declining in Tesla car sales. He's not in the administration anymore, but what is important is we can expect to see his influence in the administration or in the government widely impact his dynasty, which is covering, say, space, AI, satellites, all has a bigger impact on mobility market. And last year, our economics team, they felt improved in consumer confidence, but again, with the tariff war in place, there will be restrictions in spending, and that will impact the overall ecosystem in the market reality. Talking about supply chain, there has been impact of supply chain since the COVID. I mean, there's still lingering around, although there has been marginal improvement. When you talk about supply chain, Europe has been too much dependent on China when it comes to raw materials. But here, this is where we see a lot of policies towards driving local raw material development or local production of these materials, like, say, the Critical Material Act or the European Chip Act, which is expected to drive the supply chain ecosystem in Europe, but that also will come in a cost. Producing in Europe means not cheap, so that's also going to have an impact on cost overall. You can also expect to see hyperconnectivity and computing to drive the boundaries, and of course, we spoke a lot about AI. AI will be a key ecosystem in this whole element, and that will drive the the trend towards connected cars and connected mobility. And last but not the least, we can also expect to see polarized energy transition, especially with especially with US pulling out from the Paris Convention, which means the green energy or say energy transition will also become expensive for us in the near term. So given it might be a very gloomy picture, but it's quite important that we need to see the companies need to be a bit agile in this very volatile ecosystem. And that's where I want to talk to you about short-term trends impacting the automotive market, starting with number one, the stabilization in the growth of EV. That is something we can expect to see in the next 3 years time period. But in that context, we can also expect to see growth in hybrid vehicles. Many consumers look at hybrid technology as a sweet compromise when it comes to, say, energy, emission reduction and also, better vehicle improvement. We can also expect to see Chinese OEMs, expansion of Chinese OEMs and Tier 1 companies. When I talk about Chinese OEMs and Tier 1 companies, the important element to understand here is its expansion not to sell vehicles, but also to set up industrial or manufacturing base in many parts of the world. This is something that you'll expect to see more. And talking about China, one trend not many of them are speaking about is the sovereign wealth that China has been driving in certain countries like Pakistan or say Sri Lanka or Angola or many African countries, where they have taken a bigger stake in the investment and that could influence the policies in these markets. Another trend that we can expect in the next 2 to 3 years time period is new business models around EV. Many OEMs will be working closely with their captive arms to come out with models such as multi-life leasing, usership business models and aspects around that. In the morning, we listened to a fellow speaker talking about AI. And it's more important is AI has always been there in the automotive industry. What we can expect to see a more and more adoption of generative AI across the ecosystem, not just on the manufacturing or say logistics, but also in cabin and in vehicle systems as well. We spoke about software and connectivity. So going forward, software and connected technologies will become the backbone of the new architecture, the vehicle architecture. Robotaxis and EVs will also be evolved again in a very restricted landscape, but this is something we can expect to see in few cities in next 2 to 3 years. And in the morning, Michael mentioned about 1.5 billion cars on road. So 1.5 billion cars on road means an attractive, a huge potential aftermarket. So that's where we can expect to see a lot more OEMs and Tier 1 companies taking the control of the aftermarket primarily, which I'll talk about in detail later. In terms of driving technology, in terms of optimizing costs, you can also expect to see a lot more partnerships between OEMs and collaboration between OEMs. We can see a slowdown in growth in developed markets like US or Europe in terms of vehicle sales, whereas the sales potential will be higher in other markets like India or Middle East. And so you'll see a two-phased market economy prevailing. And last but not the least, these next 3 years will be a center point in terms of sustainable ecosystem and sustainable practices that will be deployed across the value chain in automotive industry. Now here on, we can look at more specific to aftermarket and what are the opportunities in aftermarket. Now talking about aftermarket, we need to bear in mind the trends impacting the aftermarket. On one side, the demography of the vehicles are changing. In terms, you see an aged vehicle park. At the same time, you also have increasing penetration of new technology. So increasing penetration of new technology means you have longer service interval. You also have an impact in terms of service complexity and also increase in prices. And that said, this also puts a huge pressure on the technician skill gap. That's also an impact that we can expect to see. On the other hand, if you look at consumers, the consumers right now are much more educated, much more empowered with data, and they expect a seamless digital and personalized journey in their car service ecosystem as well. Talking about consumers, we also need to bear in mind there's an increasing penetration of usership business model, which means you'll also see a lot of leased vehicles and fleet vehicles, and these kind of company cars and fleet vehicles will need a different or a professionalized care or professionalized business models to target them. And last but not the least, in many countries, we see the growth of DIFM, which is do it for me service ecosystem. This is where we expect the workshop becomes a center point in terms of providing service to end consumers. So workshops will play a crucial role in terms of taking your products to the end consumer. So we'll see more and more evolution of the B2B2C channel primarily. We have been tracking the automotive aftermarket for last 2 decades. I've been associated with the automotive aftermarket at least for last 10 years now. These are few trends that we have plotted on an XY chart. The X chart talks about the certainty of the impact, whereas the Y chart talks about the level of impact. The top 10 trends, I'll quickly walk you through that. We spoke about the aging car park. In Europe, the average age of a car is around 11 years. It's quite high, in fact, in Eastern Europe. We also talk about the recessionary outlook in the short term. We mentioned about the B2B2C evolution of business model. The OEMs deploying solutions, or OEMs taking keen interest in aftermarket is growing. This might not be a new trend, but this is going to impact the overall ecosystem in which where the drivers are going to get their cars serviced. Fleet after sales will become an important ecosystem to target fleet customers. Private labelings will grow. When we talk about private labeling, OEMs and tier ones will start using second product line to target segment 2 and segment 3 customers. We can also see growing presence of Chinese OEMs. Talking about Chinese OEMs and Chinese models, I was in China last week. I visited a few garages. They mentioned that there are close to around 8,000 to 10,000 car models, which means if many of these models come into Europe, we need to see how to support these Chinese cars on the market in terms of starting with diagnostics and supporting with the parts and services. Of course, there will be increasing share of electrified and autonomous vehicles, so we need to look into how to service and support these vehicles in the park. Early in the morning, a speaker spoke about consolidation. Consolidation is also a known trend in the aftermarket. Consolidation of the garages, consolidation of the distribution landscape, and we can expect to see this trend to grow in next 3 to 5 years, continue to be persisting in next 3 to 5 years. And last but not the least, digitalization. Digitalization in terms of services, in terms of ordering parts, you'll see new models evolving through digital practices primarily. Now moving on, this is an interesting slide. So there are 3 boxes here. The first box talks about the new car sales. The second box talks about the vehicle and operations of the car park. And the third box talks about the parts revenue. Now when you look at the charts, the blue bars refers to the global picture, whereas the red bar refers to the picture in Turkey. Now when you look into car sales, last year, the light vehicle sales, so cars and LCV sales, had a growth momentum to reach around 88 million vehicle sales, very close to how it was in pre-pandemic times in 2019. 2019, there was around 90 million light vehicles sold. So last year, around 88 million, it was quite close to reach the pre-pandemic level. Whereas if you look into Turkey specifically, around 1.2 million vehicles, light vehicles were sold. On the other hand, the park has been increasing, and it has reached around 1.5 billion cars globally. In Turkey, we have around 22 million vehicles, if I'm not wrong. So that provides a huge opportunity for aftermarket to cater to. And if you look into parts revenue, our analyst estimated that last year around 493 billion worth of aftermarket parts were sold in the market. And these are frequently replaced parts, including tires and filters and so on. So, moving on, we did a survey in G4 countries in Europe, asking the owners of cars beyond 4 years old with regards to their servicing pattern. What we found out here is nearly 70% of car drivers are quite loyal to the workshop. Okay, once they find a workshop, they don't prefer to change, and this loyalty is quite high when it comes to older people. Of course, the younger people are a bit price sensitive. In this context, we also ask them about the point of purchase when it comes to buying spare parts, lubricants, and tires. What you see here is nearly 61% or 60% of the population, they depend primarily on the workshop's advice when they buy spare parts. And that's exactly where the workshops become a key ecosystem, a key player in selling parts going forward. And this is where many companies are targeting to service or targeting to support workshops to help them to sell their parts and services quite effectively. As part of this study, we also had interviews with workshops in terms of understanding what are their challenges and what are their needs. Of course, when we spoke to workshops, there were issues with regards to labor shortages, upskilling, and ability to attract customers on, say, support and parts catalog. If I summarize all of this, there are three main pillars. Okay, one is driving traffic. They need support in driving traffic. Second, helping them to do the job, in terms of, say, training, in terms of helping them to identify right parts through right parts catalog, on-time delivery of parts. And the third one is customer retention. And this is where many distributors are targeting or building value propositions in supporting workshops with these three elements: driving traffic, supporting them to do the job, and last but not the least, supporting to retain the customers primarily. So these are some of the value propositions that many distributors are offering to the workshops, starting with, say, service support. A lot of these distributors and suppliers are offering digital platforms that helps workshops to order, purchase parts, and they provide them with a digital parts catalog that helps them to order the right parts, frequent delivery times, technical call centers to sort out, or to identify the right parts to be offered. They support financial services or financial support as well, covering trade loans, longer payment terms, or flexible contracts. They provide a lot of upskilling support like training programs, supporting in EV transition, staffing support in terms of running internships and so on. And also they provide a lot of value propositions in terms of, say, providing customer attraction tools like, say, marketing support, or, say, service aggregator platform, or loyalty programs and so on. So these are some of the key elements that companies are offering in terms of driving their sales to the B2B2C ecosystem. Moving on, sorry, I'm on this slide, sorry. Yeah, moving on, looking into digitalization, our analysts expect digital sales of parts to reach around 90 billion by 2030. In this context, they also expect the revenues of, say, digital service booking to reach around 1.2 billion by 2030. When you look into digitalization or e-commerce, this has been one of the hot topics in the automotive ecosystem. You might wonder who's going to buy parts online. Not the end consumer alone. Even the workshops tend to buy a lot more parts online. The ability to have delivery times, better delivery times, and also price competitiveness, it builds a lot more feasibility, lots more importance for e-commerce as a channel to sell parts and services primarily. We also expect to see growing penetration of EV and autonomous vehicles. When you talk about EV, yes, it does have an impact on certain parts like oil, for example, but otherwise it also has a potential for other parts. In the morning, we are talking about dampeners, we are talking about suspension or tires. So there's a lot more potential to service EV parts as well. And in this context, ADAS provides a new challenge and an opportunity to provide new parts and services targeting ADAS or autonomous vehicles or ADAS technology vehicles in the park. We spoke about OEMs. Again, like I said, this is might not be a new trend. Primarily, OEMs have been targeting independent aftermarket. When I'm talking about independent aftermarket, this is beyond the vehicles or vehicles beyond the warranty period. So there are known examples of Stellantis having Euro Repair brand, or Renault having, say, the Motorio brand, targeting all cars, all age vehicles. We also seen OEMs having the second product line. For example, Ford has its own Omnicraft brand. For example, if you look into Volkswagen, if you look at Volkswagen oil, which is a genuine oil, in all the other markets they sell Volkswagen oil in their franchisee workshops, except in Brazil. In Brazil, they also have a second product line called Maxi Performance, primarily to target vehicles in segment 2 and segment 3. Segment 2 vehicles are vehicles aged between 4 to 8 years, and segment 3 vehicles are aged 8 years and above. In this context, we also see OEMs bringing a lot more instruments. For example, in the UK, they offer financial contracts through the captive arms. For instance, Volkswagen, through the captive arm, which is Volkswagen Financial Services, they offer 0% interest to customers to take service and maintenance contracts. They also try to package service and maintenance contracts as part of used car programs. So through this, they try to engage with the end consumer through a longer service interval primarily. Now, next key trend that I want to talk about, fleets. The fleets, when I'm talking about fleets, I'm referring to company cars. In Europe, nearly 50% of cars sold are fleet cars. And if you look at Turkey, nearly 40% of the new car sales are fleet cars. And fleet cars primarily have a bit more resilience to a lot more economic impact. And this is where many of the suppliers and garages are targeting to provide the professional services to fleet customers. When you talk about fleet customers, it is important to know the different types of car funding. So in Frost & Sullivan, we look at three key funding types. One is operational leasing. So this includes cars that are leased through companies like Arval or Avens or other leasing companies, LeasePlan, which is part of Avens now. Then segment 2 customers are financially leased cars that are leased through banks like TEB or the other banks. And last but not the least, segment 3 are the vehicles that are outrightly purchased. So why do we segment into these three categories is because the person who takes a decision for aftermarket services differs in all the three categories. For example, segment 3, any service or related decisions are primarily made by the fleet manager of that particular company. Whereas in, say, segment A, any decisions with regard to aftermarket is primarily made by the operation leasing company. So this is where the insurance companies and the fleet and leasing companies are changing their approach to offer aftermarket services to their end consumers. And if you see, the share of operation leasing is expected to grow in next 2 to 3 years primarily. Now, talking about fleets, we also expect to see increasing penetration of EV as parts of the fleet market. And this is where we can see the need for dedicated partnership, restructuring of the workshop, upskilling and tools, and also look into sustainability practices and sustainability products to offer to fleet customers who are trying to embark the journey of increasing the share of fleets in their car park overall. Talking about fleets, I also want to bring to your notice about digitalization and connected services in fleets. We can expect to see a lot more digital fleet management tools and special services and digital payment options that fleets are adopting with regards to interacting with the after-sales network. And this is also another tool that consumers or the companies are trying to leverage to sell aftermarket service targeting fleet companies. So bringing all of this to end and to summarize my presentation, we can expect to see fleet after sales as an opportunity for companies to target. There's increasing proliferation of electronics, which would impact the vehicle complexity and provide new opportunities to serve these electronic new age vehicles. We can expect to see the B2, B2C evolution growing prominence. Car manufacturers entering aftermarket means new competition. And of course, e-commerce and digital services would be an important touch point or a point of sale. And electrification ADAS does not just mean fewer replacement parts, but also new opportunities to serve and provide new services primarily. So in terms of opportunities, companies should look into launching dedicated service packages targeting segment 2, segment 3 customers. Look at collaborations with workshop chains to increase penetration in IWS. When I say IWS, I'm talking about independent aftermarket. I have a targeted value propositions for fleet customers to cope with their increased complexity and professionalism, explore new opportunities in EV and ADAS, and of course, try to embrace the B2B2C channel and e-commerce digital channels in your sales portfolio or sales channels primarily. With that, I bring my presentation to an end. My contact details are here. I'm happy to take a few questions if there are any. Looks like there are no questions.
Thank you very much for your valuable speech. Was it the end of the or just in between applause? it has ended, right?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thank you very much. Once
welcome.
again, we want to distribute a plaque for you. Şimdi Sayın Mubarak Musa'ya plaketini vermesi üzere. OSS Yönetim Kurulu üyesi Sayın Halit Başbuğ, alkışlarınızla sahneye davet ediyorum. Halit Bey hoş geldiniz. Konuğumuza plaketini
Merhaba Halit
takdim edeceksiniz. Tam ortada güzel bir fotoğrafınızı rica edelim. Sayın Mubarak Musa plaketini Sayın Halit Başbuğ'dan alıyor ve bu anı ölümsüz kılıyoruz. Çok teşekkür ederiz. Thank you for your valuable information and insightful information. Thank you very much.